Hey everybody, welcome back to Integrative Psychonautics. I hope you all are doing well out there. It's a weird, wild time on planet Earth. There's a lot of strange shit going on out there and a lot of difficult times for a lot of people. So I hope whoever you are, if you're watching this, that you're safe and sound, that you're healthy, that you're stable, that you're doing okay. Okay, with all that said, today's video is going to be on simplifying our understanding of psychedelic therapy. I want to try to really just kind of boil it down to the basics of what's actually happening kind of underneath the hood, if you will, underneath all the complexity, because there's so many different ways to describe psychedelic therapy. I wanted to just give you a real basic understanding of what this process is so that you can kind of understand it, whether you're someone who's thinking about doing psychedelic therapy or you're someone who's using psychedelics and hoping to have a therapeutic experience, or you're a student or a therapist or someone who wants to learn more about this. Hopefully I can kind of clarify a little bit and kind of help simplify your understanding so that whether you're watching my channel or other channels on the topic, you can, really start to organize all of the crazy different layers of understanding and approaches and pieces of science and all that shit down into this really very basic process here. So let's get into it. Okay, so before we go ahead and talk about what's actually happening underneath the hood with psychedelic therapy, I thought it would be really useful to just take a moment and take a small detour, hopefully not too long here, into understanding and clarifying what problems actually are, because I think this becomes really relevant to understanding what's happening. Before I go ahead and talk about that, let me be really clear here that I'm just coming from my own perspective and my own training, my own background as a hypnotherapist and an NLP practitioner. Yes, I'm always studying neuroscience, trying to stay up to date with what's going on in the psychedelic science world. Yes, I'm also always studying different forms of therapy and looking at therapy from other lenses besides the bias of my own training. But fundamentally, I'm going to be speaking here as a hypnotherapist, as someone who's trained in a particular approach to hypnotherapy. So you may not agree with my angle, my perspective here. You may not recognize some of the jargon or some of the language I'm going to use. That's all okay. I just wanted to kind of acknowledge that up front. Okay, with that caveat out of the way, what's a problem? What exactly is happening when we have an issue? So I want to offer you an idea here about issues that really simplifies them too. It doesn't matter what the problem is. It doesn't matter if we're talking depression, anxiety, trauma, PTSD, a bunch of other stuff that, we commonly deal with, feeling lost in life, losing motivation, blah, 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 right? Doesn't matter what the issue is. Fundamentally, what's happening, and this is the thing I want you to understand, is some sort of pattern in your nervous system in the moment. Now, the reason I say this is because most of us, when we tend to think of issues, we tend to think of, something happened to me in the past, and I need to figure out what it was, and it's a thing back there in my past that I can no longer deal with actively in the moment, that's impacting me now, that's causing me all kinds of issues, and it's a mysterious thing that I don't quite know what happened, right? It's debatable whether or not that's accurate or a really true rendering of problems and a true description of it, but this is how most of us tend to think of it, right? I think that that's not so useful for actually healing to think of it that way. I think it's so much more useful to just think of it as, what is the problem? When is the problem happening? It's happening in real time in my life right now. So if I have a trauma response, whatever caused the trauma response is done. Hopefully, it's over. It's in the past. It's gone. What I'm dealing with now is the trauma is in the moment. It's not in the past. It's what my body is doing as a habituated pattern on loop over and over in response to what I lived through in the past, right? So this would be some cluster of body sensations, right? Some cluster of belief system, body sensation, maybe mental images, maybe patterns of emotion, patterns of perception. This is a big one because we don't often challenge or notice how our perceptions may be being colored or filtered through the lens of problem thinking, let's say. Patterns of, physiology, patterns of behavior, patterns of reaction. These are all habituated automatic things happening in the nervous system that kind of cluster together to create the effect or the ongoing experience that we would call the problem, whatever the problem is. Okay, so I hope that's clear. I hope that makes sense. So there's a term for this, there's a few terms for this, but one way this is thought of in therapy is this is what's called a schema, right? So this is a cluster or collection of automatic responses and behaviors and perceptions and beliefs and thoughts and emotions that tend to be habitual and cyclical or have a strong cause response in relationship to a trigger or a scenario or context that over time becomes so normalized into our nervous system that it becomes a chronic issue, right? So this is what most of us are dealing with most of the time. Okay, let's go ahead now that you know that and talk about what's happening in psychedelic therapy. So in psychedelic therapy, essentially what we're doing at any given moment is we are using the medicine to help your nervous system kind of unwire that a bit, to start to disrupt and interrupt the pattern of the usual, self-recurring problem, whether it's, this rumination or, a fear response, feeling triggered by something, a phobia, whatever it is. We are using the medicine to interrupt the neurology of that, loosen that up, essentially lift that out of the kind of tight, cold, frozen state. Again, if you want to use a neuroplasticity model here, it's like we're heating up the plastic enough to loosen it up. And then we're making changes to how you experience the problem. So this can be, essentially what's called memory reconsolidation, which is really the underlying neuroscience of what's going on when we make a change and then rewire the brain. You can think of it in terms of we are opening up the critical period with medicine where we are more impressionable. You could think of it as re-imprinting, where we are taking, some sort of positive memory, positive experience, maybe directly from the psychedelic, maybe from the way that the therapist is embodying themselves as a role model or a safety figure of safety for us. You could think of it in terms, again, of neuroplasticity. I think these are all synonyms, more or less, right? There's maybe some discrepancies here in strict definition, but I think generally these are synonyms for the same process. And so what we are doing is we are kind of moving and reshaping. We're interrupting the pattern of the problem. We are making changes to it. We are resourcing it. We are transforming it. We are recontextualizing it. We are shrinking it. These are all different ways you could think about it. And then as the brain starts to come down off the medicine, it's essentially like it's re-hardening the plastic, or we are kind of slowly congealing back into this new repatterned state. That's essentially all that psychedelic therapy is. Before we wrap on the video, I want to tag on a few key points kind of behind that. So now that you know that essentially the problem is this pattern in the nervous system that's habituated, and then what we need to do for a transformational experience. And this is kind of the difference between transformation and some of the other forms of therapy out there, is that, essentially we are interrupting that pattern. We are rewiring it. We are either taking the charge out of it. We are bringing resources to it. We are in some way reshaping it, shrinking it, however you want to think about that, and then kind of rewiring that back in, right? So there are a few things I want you to know about this. The first thing I want you to know about this is that this is always available to you. Now, this is one of these things that you kind of have to be in like some kind of like extreme, like little niches of the therapy world to even get this message, which blows my fucking mind, pardon my French here. This should be widely known, but it's always possible to reconsolidate memories and to rewire your brain and to lift things out of that frozen state and make changes to them. This is the art and the skill of transformational work. And there's neuroscience that backs this up. It's called memory reconsolidation. You can look it up. And this is always available to you. So that's the first thing I would want you to know. You don't need psychedelics to do this. Second thing I would say about that is psychedelics can often make this easier. In other words, they can make it feel safer. They can facilitate this and make it a little more, slightly more passive process for us. They can make that change deeper. They can help things to really wire into the nervous system, really re-imprint in a powerful way. But they can also make it harder too, Because, for example, if you're taking a psychedelic, let's say your problem is some form of like anxiety or stress or fear response, and there's a lot of sympathetic activation involved in it. You get overwhelmed, overloaded, frightened, you're like at your limit. Taking something like psilocybin or LSD, which are also stimulating and activating and not soothing to the fear center of the brain, the amygdala, generally are going to make that work harder, right? Or at least more challenging, unless you're both skillful at feeling resourced and, self-regulating, and the person you're working with is really good at kind of leading you through that in a really safe way. But if you're trying to do this on your own, there's a really good chance that anxiety and that overload is going to make it harder with a classic psychedelic. So sometimes psychedelics can work against this process, right? So you have to pick the right medicine. You have to work with the right person. You kind of have to know what you're doing a bit, right? This is important, which kind of brings me to my third point here. Just taking psychedelics doesn't necessarily guarantee like a powerful memory reconsolidation experience. I've not only taken a bunch recreationally and not had these kinds of experiences, but also I've seen a lot of other people who were convinced they had a big transformational experience come down, and lo and behold, they have the same pattern or problem in their life, which kind of leads me to point 4 here, which is that there are certain parts of the nervous system, there are certain layers and levels that are really hard to get to, even with psychedelics. Okay, doesn't mean you can't reach there, doesn't mean you can't re-imprint them, but generally speaking, when we're talking about like the kind of relational trauma, so early childhood stuff, attachment wounding stuff, we're talking CPTSD, we're talking deeply embedded relational models that you learned in your first 3 years of life, that kind of stuff. For most people, what I've observed is it doesn't matter how much psychedelics they end up taking on their own. Doesn't matter how profound the mystical experience they've had it. And by the way, I'm talking about myself here as well as a bunch of other people I've known in my life. I've gone there. I've gone deep with psychedelics. And even still, it doesn't reach into these corners of the nervous system, into these parts of the brain and the mind, unless you're working with someone who knows how to really open that stuff up and help you get in there. Okay. So just taking psychedelics is not a guarantee that this is going to automatically self-heal, that you're going to automatically repattern your relational trauma, your attachment wounding. It can happen. They can be used together to get there, but it's not a guarantee. And so I want to make that point really, really clearly here. Thinking really quick, are there any other points? No, I don't think so. I think that really covers it for now. So just quick summary, we'll wrap the video. Essentially, problems are patterns in the nervous system that are in the now. They are not in the past. They are not necessarily bound to your narrative or to memories or having to have that in order to resolve. It's literally just what's happening. How do you know the problem fucking exists in your nervous system now? Whatever that is, whether it's a body sensation or recurring thought or rumination or a cycle of emotions you go through, an up and down you go through, what have you, that's what we're working with. That's actually the thing. Second point is that essentially with psychedelics, what we're doing, but you don't need psychedelics to do this, we are opening up that window for memory reconsolidation and making changes to the problem to transform it that once you come down starts to create a more lasting rewiring. So again, you can think of that as neuroplasticity. You could think of that as re-imprinting. You can think of that as opening the critical period and then closing the critical period. A lot of different ways to frame this or describe it, but it's essentially this one process. And this is how transformation happens. This is how deep healing happens. This is how we pivot from whatever problem pattern we're in into a new pattern. And that's really all transformation is. We're like, I have this pattern in my life and I want that pattern in my life. How do I get from A to B? It's about softening and opening up the old one, transforming it, moving you into the new one. It's as simple as that. Much love to you all. We're going to call it good here, and I'll have new videos for you soon. I hope you all are safe and sound and healthy, and I appreciate you all deeply. Take care.